I never imagined that moving into what was advertised as a peaceful, upscale community by the lake would turn into one of the most stressful battles of my life. My wife and I had worked hard to build everything we owned. She's a brilliant woman, someone who dedicated years of her life to studying law, climbing through endless nights of textbooks and court internships until she finally earned her place as a respected judge. I've always admired her strength, her calm presence, and her ability to cut through nonsense with nothing but logic and fairness. We bought this home because it was supposed to be a retreat from the noise of the city, a chance to enjoy some quiet mornings together by the water, and maybe even grow old here. But what we didn't know was that this so-called idyllic neighborhood came with its own disease, an HOA president who acted like she was crowned queen of the entire subdivision. The neighbors called her Karen behind her back, and as soon as I met her, I realized the name was earned. She had that fake, permanent smile, the kind that hides sharp judgment behind every word, and her favorite sport was catching residents doing something out of compliance. Whether it was the length of your grass, the color of your front door, or even how long a car was parked in your driveway, she had a fine ready in her little clipboard of doom. At first, my wife told me to ignore her, that people like Karen thrived on attention and confrontation, but then came the day when Karen decided to target us directly. It all started with a ridiculous letter slipped into our mailbox claiming that our front lawn violated community standards. According to Karen, the small garden bed my wife had planted with tulips and lavender wasn't uniform enough with the other properties. Never mind that it looked beautiful and several neighbors even complimented it. Karen insisted it was disruptive to the neighborhood's aesthetic. The fine she slapped us with was a jaw-dropping $3,500. When I read it, I nearly choked. It wasn't like we had trash in the yard or broken furniture lying around. It was flowers. Flowers. I was furious, ready to storm over to Karen's house and demand an explanation, but my wife, calm as ever, placed her hand over mine and said, "We're not paying this nonsense." She explained that HOA rules were enforceable only within reason, and this fine was absurdly inflated, bordering on harassment. She knew the law better than anyone else in that neighborhood, but the problem was, Karen didn't know who she was messing with. To Karen, we were just another couple to bully into submission. Days went by, and Karen sent more letters, each more threatening than the last. She even stood on the sidewalk one afternoon, snapping pictures of our lawn like some kind of paparazzi catching a scandal. My wife laughed it off, but I could see the fire in her eyes. She was waiting, patiently, for Karen to push the wrong button. That moment came faster than we expected. One Saturday morning, as I was cleaning the garage, I noticed a police cruiser pulling up in front of our house. Behind it was another patrol car, and before I could process what was happening, Karen strutted out from the sidewalk like she had summoned an army. She wore her bright pink suit, pearls jangling around her neck, and the smuggest grin I'd ever seen. Finally, she declared loud enough for the entire street to hear, "The law is here to deal with these rule breakers." My wife stepped out onto the porch, calm as ever, holding a cup of coffee as if nothing in the world could disturb her. The officers approached us, one carrying a thick folder that looked suspiciously like the case Karen had built against us. "Sir, ma'am," the lead officer began, "we received a complaint from the HOA regarding unpaid fines amounting to $3,500. Karen practically clapped her hands with glee. "You see, they've been ignoring the rules. I told you, officers, this is unacceptable." My blood boiled, but before I could speak, my wife set her coffee cup down, straightened her shoulders, and fixed the officer with the kind of look that could silence an entire courtroom. "And what exactly," she asked in that steady, commanding tone I knew so well, "do you intend to do about it?" The officer froze. He studied her face, his brows furrowing as if something clicked in his mind, and then he asked, almost cautiously, "Wait, Judge. You live here." The silence that followed was so thick you could hear the wind rustling through the trees. Karen's smug smile faltered as the officer's words hung in the air. My wife didn't flinch. She simply nodded once and replied, "Yes, I do. And unless you've come with a legitimate legal order, I suggest you reconsider wasting taxpayer resources on what is clearly a civil dispute, not a criminal matter." The younger officer behind the lead one shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Karen and my wife like he wasn't sure which authority he was supposed to obey. Karen, however, didn't take the hint. She screeched, "She's lying. She's no judge, she's just another entitled homeowner who thinks she's above the rules." But the lead officer's entire demeanor had changed. He straightened, almost saluted out of instinct, and said with clear respect, "Yes, Your Honor." The words carried more weight than a gavel striking would. Karen's face turned the color of a ripe tomato, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She hadn't expected her power play to backfire this spectacularly. Meanwhile, I struggled not to laugh out loud at the sight. The woman who had terrorized this neighborhood with her petty fines and self-righteousness was suddenly the one caught completely off guard. My wife, calm and composed, leaned slightly toward Karen and said, "You might want to be careful about how you proceed from here. Filing false reports and harassing residents can have consequences." That was the first time I saw Karen's confidence crack. Her eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up, but the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered was no longer on her side. They whispered to each other, clearly enjoying the downfall of the self-appointed queen of the HOA. The officers excused themselves quickly after confirming there was no criminal matter at hand, and one of them even muttered an apology to my wife before heading back to the cruiser. Karen, humiliated, stood frozen in place, clutching her purse like a lifeline. My wife didn't rub it in, though she easily could have. Instead, she picked up her coffee, turned to me, and said, "Well, that was entertaining. Shall we get back to our morning?" It was such a power move, so effortlessly dismissive, that I nearly burst out laughing once the officers drove away. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She would lick her wounds, retreat for now, and come back with another scheme. My wife knew it too. As we sat back on the porch, watching the lake shimmer in the distance, she told me in that calm, steady voice of hers, "She just made this personal. And trust me, she has no idea what kind of storm she's unleashed." For a few weeks after the police incident, things seemed strangely quiet. Karen, who normally paraded through the neighborhood like she owned the place, suddenly kept her distance. I would occasionally see her peeking from behind her curtains when I went to grab the mail, or hovering at the end of her driveway when my wife and I drove past, but she didn't approach us. Part of me hoped that the embarrassment of being shut down so publicly had finally knocked some sense into her. But my wife, wise as ever, warned me not to get comfortable. She had dealt with people like Karen in the courtroom, people who thrived on control and manipulation. They didn't give up, they just changed tactics. Sure enough, about 3 weeks later, the first sign of her counterattack arrived. We got a thick envelope in the mail stamped with the HOA's official letterhead. Inside was a list of violations that supposedly applied to our property. The color of our shutters was too dark, the bird feeder in our backyard attracted pests, and apparently the small wind chime on our porch was against the noise ordinance. All of it was ridiculous, nitpicky nonsense, but at the bottom of the letter was the real punchline: total fines owed, $9,750. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. My wife didn't even crack a smile. She carefully read the entire packet, then folded it up and set it aside as if it were nothing more than junk mail. "This," she said calmly, "is harassment. And she just handed me all the evidence I need." The escalation didn't stop with letters. Suddenly, neighbors who had always been friendly started acting distant. The couple across the street, who used to wave every morning, now avoided eye contact. A few even whispered as we passed, clearly repeating whatever rumors Karen had spread. I found out later that she'd been holding special HOA meetings, where she painted us as rule breakers who thought they were above the community. She even went as far as to suggest that my wife had lied about being a judge, claiming she was just a lawyer who never made it, and that the police only respected her because she pretended to have power. The audacity was unbelievable. One evening, a neighbor I trusted pulled me aside and said Karen had been drafting a motion to have us forcibly removed from the HOA, essentially trying to make us sell our home. That was the moment my wife's patience ran out. She had warned me before that Karen had no idea what kind of storm she was bringing upon herself, and now I understood. My wife spent the next several nights in her home office, the glow of her laptop spilling out into the hallway as she worked late into the night. I peeked in once and saw stacks of HOA bylaws, legal texts, and even case law printouts spread across her desk. She wasn't just preparing a defense, she was preparing to dismantle the HOA's entire foundation. The breaking point came at the next community-wide HOA meeting. Karen, wearing yet another of her loud, brightly colored suits, stood at the front with her ever-present clipboard. The room was packed. It seemed half the neighborhood had shown up, probably expecting some fireworks. Karen started with her usual theatrics, announcing serious violations by certain residents, but of course, she quickly turned her focus on us. She dramatically held up a file, thick with papers, and said, "This family has repeatedly defied our rules, ignored fines, and disrespected the very standards that keep our community safe and beautiful." She actually got a few nods from the crowd, and for a second, I worried that people might buy into her nonsense. Then my wife stood. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't slam her fist, she simply began to speak with the calm authority that only someone who has commanded a courtroom could muster. "I am, in fact, a judge," she said, pulling out her official ID and setting it on the table where everyone could see. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "And what this HOA has done, under the direction of your president, is not only unreasonable, but unlawful." She then produced copies of the inflated fines, the fabricated violations, and even cited legal precedents where HOAs had been sued, and lost, for harassment and abuse of power. Karen's face drained of color as my wife laid everything out methodically, piece by piece, like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. By the end, the room was dead silent except for the sound of Karen's shaky breathing. What happened next was nothing short of poetic justice. One of the board members, clearly shaken by my wife's evidence, spoke up and said, I wasn't aware of any of this. I thought we were enforcing actual rules, not making them up." Another quickly chimed in, agreeing that Karen had gone too far. The tide turned fast. Neighbors who had been distant started whispering apologies, realizing they'd been duped. Finally, one brave soul stood up and called for a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. I swear, I've never seen panic spread across someone's face so quickly. Karen tried to argue, tried to shout down anyone who disagreed with her, but the more she flailed, the more obvious her desperation became. My wife didn't gloat, she didn't smile, she just sat quietly, sipping her water, as the board voted overwhelmingly to remove Karen as president effective immediately. The look on her face when the gavel came down, ironically, not my wife's gavel but the board's, was priceless. She stormed out of the meeting, clutching her purse, muttering about ungrateful traitors and lawsuits, but everyone knew it was over. In the days that followed, the atmosphere of the neighborhood completely changed. People who had once avoided us now came over with baked goods, apologies, and even thank yous for standing up to Karen. The new board rescinded all the bogus fines, including the original $3,500, and promised to review the HOA bylaws to prevent abuse of power in the future. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to vanish. Her bright suits and loud voice were nowhere to be seen, though rumors swirled that she was trying to sell her house and move to another community where she could start fresh. My wife, ever gracious, never rubbed it in, though I could tell she felt a quiet satisfaction at having turned the tables. As for me, I finally understood the full weight of what it meant to be married to a woman like her. She wasn't just my wife, she was a force of nature, someone who could face down injustice without ever raising her voice, and win. And while I hoped we'd never have to go through something like this again, part of me knew that if anyone ever tried to mess with us, they'd find out exactly what Karen did. When you go after a judge in her own home, you'd better be ready for the verdict. Just when I thought the nightmare was over and the neighborhood could finally breathe without Karen's iron grip, she made one last desperate attempt to claw her way back into power. For a while, it seemed she had vanished. Weeks passed, and the most I saw of her was her car parked in the driveway, curtains drawn tight like she was hiding from the world. Then one afternoon, a certified letter arrived addressed to my wife. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and inside was a summons. Karen had filed a lawsuit against us personally, claiming defamation of character and loss of reputation due to my wife's false statements at the HOA meeting. I swear my jaw nearly hit the floor. The sheer audacity of this woman was unbelievable. She had been exposed for her lies, humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, stripped of her little throne, and yet here she was trying to drag us into court as if she still held some power. My blood boiled, but my wife, ever the picture of calm, simply flipped through the documents like she was reviewing the morning paper. Then she smirked, that subtle little smile that always told me she was 5 steps ahead. She just buried herself deeper, she said. This is going to be fun. Over the next few weeks, Karen went on a rampage. She tried to rally neighbors to her side again, spinning wild stories that my wife had used her judge status to intimidate the police and the HOA. She even tried reaching out to a local reporter, painting herself as a brave community leader standing up against corruption. It was laughable, really, but also exhausting. We'd walk down the street and see her standing with a clipboard, shoving petitions into people's hands, trying to get signatures for her lawsuit. Most neighbors brushed her off, some outright laughed in her face, but a handful, those few who thrived on drama, encouraged her. Meanwhile, my wife was meticulously building her case. She documented every bogus fine, every threatening letter, every fabricated violation. She even subpoenaed the HOA's records, exposing Karen's misuse of funds during her presidency, money that mysteriously vanished under the guise of community improvements that never happened. I watched in awe as my wife worked, not with anger, but with precision, as if she were simply putting together a puzzle. Karen thought she was dragging us into her game, but what she didn't realize was that she had just handed my wife the perfect stage to end this once and for all. The day of the hearing finally came. It wasn't a full-blown trial, but the courtroom was packed nonetheless. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and people showed up just to watch the drama unfold. Karen arrived dressed like she was attending a royal gala, bright red suit, oversized pearls, hair teased into a helmet of defiance. She strutted into the courtroom with the arrogance of someone who truly believed she was about to win. My wife, on the other hand, walked in with quiet dignity, a simple black suit, her judge's badge tucked discreetly into her briefcase. She wasn't there as a judge today, she was there as a defendant. But watching her sit at that table, calm and unshaken, I knew Karen was in over her head. When it was time to present her case, Karen launched into a tirade, her voice shrill as she painted herself as a victim of lies and harassment. She waved around pictures of our yard, copies of letters she had written, and even accused us of conspiring with the police to embarrass her. The judge presiding over the case, an older man with little patience for theatrics, listened for a while, then finally raised a hand. Ms. Karen, do you have any actual evidence of defamation? Or is this just your opinion of how events transpired? The silence that followed was deafening. When it was my wife's turn, the entire energy of the room shifted. She spoke with the measured authority of someone who knew the law inside and out. She presented the bogus fines, the harassment letters, the false police report, and even the financial discrepancies in the HOA's budget under Karen's leadership. Every piece of evidence was neat, organized, undeniable. She didn't raise her voice, didn't insult Karen, didn't gloat, she simply laid out the truth like a surgeon making precise incisions. By the time she was done, the judge leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and said, "It seems to me, Ms. Karen, that not only is there no evidence of defamation here, but there is substantial evidence that you have, in fact, abused your authority as HOA president. I strongly advise you to reconsider pursuing this any further, as you may find yourself facing counterclaims." Karen's face drained of color. For once, she had no comeback. She stammered, opened her mouth, closed it again, and then finally muttered something incoherent before sinking into her seat. The gavel came down, and just like that, her lawsuit was dismissed. The fallout was immediate and brutal, for Karen, at least. News of the dismissal spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Those who had once entertained her stories now openly mocked her. The new HOA board launched an internal audit, and with the evidence my wife had uncovered, they pursued legal action against Karen for the missing funds. Within months, she was forced to sell her house to cover the costs, her reputation in shreds, her once proud strut reduced to a hurried shuffle as she left the neighborhood for good. As for us, life finally settled into the peace we had originally moved there for. Neighbors treated my wife with a newfound respect, some even jokingly calling her, "Your Honor," whenever she walked by. But my wife never let it go to her head. She'd just smile, wave, and return to her garden, the very same garden that had sparked this entire war. Looking back now, I realize Karen's downfall wasn't just about us or the HOA. It was a lesson in what happens when arrogance collides with integrity. Karen thought she could bully us with fines, threats, and lies. She never realized that behind the quiet smile of the woman she targeted stood not just a homeowner, but a judge who knew exactly how to deliver justice. And justice, as Karen learned the hard way, always wins in the end. For a while after Karen finally packed up and left, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. It was quieter, friendlier, almost as if everyone had taken a collective deep breath after years of suffocating under her rules. My wife and I could finally enjoy our mornings on the porch without feeling like eyes were boring into us from across the street. We planted more flowers, added a new swing to the backyard, and even hosted a little barbecue for the neighbors who had stood by us. Life was good, but as we learned, power doesn't vanish, it just shifts. Without Karen at the helm, the HOA scrambled to reorganize, and while the new board was far more reasonable, cracks started to appear. Old grudges between board members flared up, finances had to be untangled after Karen's mismanagement, and suddenly, everyone looked to my wife for answers. They knew she was a judge, they had seen her dismantle Karen in public, and now they wanted her to take a more active role in the community. At first, she resisted. "I already have a courtroom," she told me with a weary smile, "I don't need another one in my backyard." But the pressure mounted, and soon she found herself drawn into disputes, not officially, but neighbors would come knocking, asking her to weigh in on everything from fence heights to barking dogs. It was flattering, sure, but also dangerous. Because as much as Karen had been the obvious villain, her downfall left a vacuum, and vacuums attract people just as hungry for control. The first signs of trouble came from someone we hadn't expected, Mr. Douglas, a retired businessman who had lived on the far side of the lake for years. He had always kept to himself, a polite man in passing, but after Karen's exit, he began attending every HOA meeting with a sudden and surprising enthusiasm. At first, we thought it was harmless, maybe he just wanted to help clean up the mess Karen left behind. But slowly, his speeches grew bolder. He criticized the new board for being too soft, argued that fines were necessary for order, and even suggested that the community needed a return to stricter oversight. I couldn't believe it. After everything we had just gone through, someone was actually campaigning to bring back a system just as oppressive as Karen's, only wrapped in a calmer, more professional package. What made it worse was that some people listened. Douglas had a charm about him, a smooth way of talking that made unreasonable ideas sound logical. I saw the way neighbors nodded when he spoke, the way some even started repeating his lines about protecting property values. My wife, of course, saw right through it. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the lake, she sighed and said, "Karen was loud, but Douglas is patient. That makes him far more dangerous." Her words proved true sooner than I expected. Douglas began filing proposals with the board, little things at first, like requiring homeowners to get approval before putting up seasonal decorations. Then came rules about yard maintenance standards and noise restrictions. It felt like déjà vu, only worse, because Douglas wasn't making a spectacle like Karen had. He framed everything as improvements and common sense policies. When people objected, he didn't yell, he simply smiled, listened, and promised to review their concerns. Then, a month later, the rules passed anyway. By the time most neighbors realized what was happening, the noose was already tightening. My wife tried to warn them, but many were too distracted by the apparent order Douglas was bringing back. "At least he's not Karen," they would say, as if that alone excused everything. It was maddening. I could see the frustration in my wife's eyes. She wanted to step in, to stop the slow creep of control, but she knew her role as a judge meant she couldn't just wade into every neighborhood squabble. Still, Douglas wasn't blind. He knew who my wife was, and I could sense he saw her as the only real obstacle standing in his way. His smiles toward her always felt a little too tight, his compliments a little too rehearsed. One evening, after another tense HOA meeting, he approached us directly. "With your expertise," he said smoothly to my wife, "you'd make an excellent addition to the board. We could really use your guidance." My wife didn't miss a beat. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Or maybe what you need is someone who actually believes in fairness." His smile never faltered, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. That was the moment the battle lines were drawn. From that point forward, it became clear that Douglas wasn't just aiming to control the HOA, he was aiming to control my wife's influence. Subtle rumors began to spread, whispered conversations that somehow always traced back to him. People started questioning whether my wife was overstepping, whether she was trying to run the community behind the scenes. At one meeting, a neighbor even suggested that her status as a judge made her intimidating, as if her very presence was some kind of unfair advantage. It was Karen all over again, only this time, the attacks were more strategic, more insidious. My wife didn't flinch, of course. She handled every jab with grace, calmly redirecting conversations back to facts, never letting herself get dragged into emotional traps. But I could tell it weighed on her. She'd come home after meetings, kick off her heels, and sink into the couch with a tired sigh. "It's not the rules that bother me," she told me one night, "it's the manipulation." Karen was a storm, obvious, messy, loud. Douglas is a shadow. You don't see the damage until it's already done. That's when I realized Karen may have been the first villain of this neighborhood, but she wasn't the last. And if Douglas had his way, he would turn our peaceful lakefront retreat into a kingdom with himself on the throne. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. We had fought so hard to free ourselves and our neighbors from Karen's tyranny, only to face a subtler, more dangerous enemy. But this time, things were different. My wife wasn't caught off guard. She knew the game Douglas was playing, and she was already preparing her countermoves. I caught glimpses of it in the way she took notes at meetings, the way she researched bylaws late at night, the way she spoke with neighbors one-on-one instead of confronting Douglas head-on. She wasn't just planning to stop him, she was planning to expose him in a way that left no room for doubt. As for me, I felt that familiar mix of pride and awe. Watching her navigate these battles reminded me once again why I fell in love with her. She wasn't just smart, she was unshakable. Douglas thought he could outmaneuver her, but he had no idea what kind of force he was up against. Karen had learned it the hard way, and soon enough, Douglas would too. Because in our household, justice doesn't clock out when the courtroom closes. It follows us home, it sits on the porch with us at sunset, and when someone tries to threaten it, justice always, always, fights back. It didn't take long for Douglas's mask to start slipping. At first, he played the role of the calm businessman, the reasonable neighbor, the one who only wanted to protect the community. But behind closed doors, whispers began surfacing. A neighbor who worked in real estate mentioned that Douglas had been quietly buying up small plots of land around the lake, almost like he was preparing for some kind of expansion. Another neighbor who once volunteered on the board swore she had seen him pressuring members into approving expenses without proper votes. My wife listened to all of this carefully, piecing together a picture that was becoming more and more disturbing. "This isn't about rules," she said one evening, her voice low but steady. "It's about control. Karen wanted power because of her ego. Douglas wants it because he's building something bigger than the HOA." That thought chilled me. Because if Karen had been a storm and Douglas a shadow, this was something far more dangerous. He wasn't just trying to boss people around, he was playing chess with the entire community as his board. And from the way he carried himself at the next meeting, smiling like a cat who had already cornered the mouse, I knew my wife was right. The turning point came when Douglas introduced his most ambitious proposal yet, a community development plan that, on the surface, sounded harmless. He spoke about new amenities, a community park, even the possibility of building a small marina by the lake. People's eyes lit up at the words, increased property value, and family-friendly improvements. But buried deep in the fine print were clauses that gave the HOA sweeping new powers, including the authority to enforce liens more aggressively, approve construction projects without full community votes, and even restrict property sales under certain conditions. My wife read it line by line, her jaw tightening as she uncovered the hidden traps. "If this passes," she whispered to me, "Douglas won't just control the board, he'll control who can live here, how they live, and what they pay." At the meeting, she tried to raise concerns, but Douglas deflected smoothly, dismissing her warnings as misinterpretations and legal overreach. The crowd was torn, half suspicious, half dazzled by his promises. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker across my wife's face. Not doubt in herself, but in whether the neighbors would recognize the wolf in sheep's clothing before it was too late. That night, she stayed up until dawn, pulling every document she could find, determined to unmask him before the vote. The days leading up to the vote were tense. Douglas campaigned like a politician, shaking hands, holding informal gatherings, and sending out glossy pamphlets with pictures of happy families on playgrounds. Meanwhile, my wife worked quietly, strategically. She spoke with neighbors one-on-one, showing them the hidden clauses, explaining what they really meant in plain language. She gathered financial records, tracked Douglas's property purchases, and even dug into his business history. What she found was damning. Douglas had a trail of failed developments in nearby towns, communities where he had swooped in with promises, taken control of HOAs, and funneled money into his own projects before leaving the residents drowning in debt. Armed with this knowledge, my wife prepared her case like it was the trial of her life. "This isn't just about us," she told me, exhaustion in her eyes but fire in her voice. "It's about protecting everyone here from being used." I watched her balance the weight of the community on her shoulders, and I realized Douglas had underestimated the one thing that made my wife unstoppable. When she fought, she never fought for herself, she fought for justice. The night of the vote felt more like a courtroom than an HOA meeting. The room was packed, tension buzzing in the air like static. Douglas gave his polished presentation, complete with charts and smiling stock photos, painting his plan as the golden ticket to a better future. People clapped, some even cheered. Then my wife rose to speak. She didn't use flashy slides or big promises, just facts. She laid out Douglas's history, the failed developments, the lawsuits, the debt he had left behind in other towns. She showed proof of his quiet land grabs, evidence that tied his so-called community improvements to his personal financial gain. Murmurs spread through the crowd, eyes widening as the truth settled in. Douglas tried to interrupt, tried to paint her as fearmongering, but this time, his calm facade cracked. His voice grew sharp, defensive, and the more he spoke, the guiltier he sounded. My wife ended her speech with words that silenced the room. You don't have to take my word for it. The evidence is right here. You can choose to hand over your freedom, your homes, and your future to a man who has already destroyed other communities. Or you can choose to protect your families and your peace. The decision is yours. When the votes were counted, it wasn't even close. The proposal failed by a landslide. Douglas's smile vanished completely as the board announced the results. He tried to recover, tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. Neighbors who had once admired him now looked at him with suspicion, even anger. Whispers of his failed projects spread like wildfire, and within weeks, he stopped showing up to meetings altogether. Rumor had it he was looking to sell his property, just like Karen before him. As for my wife, she didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. She simply came home, kicked off her shoes, and sat quietly on the porch, staring out at the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. When I asked what she was thinking, she smiled faintly and said, "Justice doesn't always wear robes or bang a gavel. Sometimes, it just sits on a folding chair at an HOA meeting." I laughed, but deep down, I understood the weight of her words. We hadn't just beaten Karen. We hadn't just stopped Douglas. We had proven, once again, that integrity is stronger than manipulation, and that even in the smallest of battles, justice always finds a way to prevail.